Hello and good morning, Keller Williams Greater Metropolitan, and welcome to our monthly Broker Mastermind. We have a very special treat for you today, as there are not one but two brokers on the call. And you know and love our friend Andrew Ginter, broker for Keller Williams Greater Metropolitan. But allow me to introduce you to Noreen Marlowe. Noreen has been with Keller Williams for 16 years. She was one of the founding agents for the Keller Williams Greater Cleveland Northeast office, where she serves as the broker and operating principal. So think of her as a much more talented and capable combination of both myself and Andrew. We are very excited to have Noreen with us today. She is heavily involved at all levels of our industry, from local boards to state boards, plugged in at the National Association of Realtors. But most relevant to today's conversation, Noreen was part of the group that actually drafted, created, revised, and reviewed what is now our statewide purchase agreement. As more and more offices move in the direction of adopting that as their purchase agreement, and as we will see them as listing agents or sometimes be requested to write them when representing buyers, we thought it very important to start a very clear and consistent conversation about what exactly was the genesis for a statewide purchase agreement, what are some of the most impactful differences or additions, and then, of course, how are we going to see this showing up and how do we use it to better serve our clients? So without any further ado, I have a spotlit and will now turn the floor over to both Noreen and Andrew to take us through our day.
Great. All right. I guess I'll talk first. Hi, thanks everyone for joining us. I appreciate your ability to be interested in learning about this on some level. So as Mike had said, I'll give you a little bit of the background, because I think the background is an important part of the story for you to understand what the heck this is and where the heck it came from. So in 2019, I was approached, as Mike mentioned, I'm pretty actively involved at Ohio Realtors. I was approached by the then president, AJ Fry of Ohio Realtors Association, and asked me if I'd be interested in chairing a task force to see if brokers in the state of Ohio would be interested in getting together with a statewide purchase agreement. The reason you want to know that is because over the years of the history of Ohio Realtors, this had been attempted 4 to 5 other times, most relevant in the past 25 years, probably that amount of times. And when they sent a survey out to the brokers in the state, there was never enough interest in it to get it together. So in 2019, when that survey was sent out, over 67% of the brokers in the state showed an interest in wanting to have a statewide purchase agreement. So from that, we then created a new committee at the state of Ohio that has never been there and is now a permanent committee. It's called their Forms Committee. We did some diving into what that should consist of. And if you understand anything going on at the state of Ohio is divided into 5 regions. And of those 5 regions, for the state purposes, we have 2 district vice presidents in every one of those regions, representing the region as the liaison between the local boards and Ohio. So we set this forms committee up to be the same exact way, to set up 5 regions with 2 representatives on this committee to help write this document from each area. So I did request that if I was going to chair that committee and serve on the writing of this document, that I would only consider doing it if my cohort of the Northeast region was John Deegan from Howard Hanna's legal division. Why did I request that? Well, for those of you that know and respect John Deegan, he's one of the most brilliant minds in real estate law in the area. Also, John comes with being the chief legal counsel for Howard Hanna, where at that time, Howard Hanna was in 6 states, of which 4 of them had statewide purchase agreements. So I felt John's knowledge coming into our committee would be important to what we were going to do. And John's very easy to work with. So John and I moved forward with this with the rest of the 8 participants, and we represented the Northeast. Then at that time, we also had one staff member from Ohio Realtors, Erica Jones, who was our wingman in this whole process. And we had Peg Rittenauer and Lori Garland, who were the chief legal advocates at the state for us. So that comprised our committee. And you know, what happened in 2020, I'm not sure if any of you might remember, but COVID hit in 2020. And for the purposes of our committee, I can tell you that actually helped our committee, because otherwise they would have wanted to meet in person to be doing these meetings, and we still wouldn't be done. So we were able to access Zoom and do these meetings. And for the duration of 2 years, it took us to draft this document, of which there were more than 1,000 hours of volunteerism in it. We would get together and we would have 2-hour Zoom meetings covering this whole contract from start to finish. We broke into small groups, focus groups of certain areas to focus on, because there are big rocks in here that were difficult to make a blanketed purchase agreement for a state that does things differently. And that was the reason people always said they weren't interested in it, because geographically we do things differently. So the finished product, we feel we did a good job in addressing a lot of that. The finished product is also a little bit more conducive to the times that we're in, because nowadays agents have a tendency to sell more throughout the state than we've ever done in the past, right? And we thought that as brokers, which is why the brokers requested it, it would be so wonderful that at some point people were using more of the same document. So naturally, when we first had the discussion in the focus group, in the initial meetings, it came to our conclusion that there was no way this could be considered a mandatory document, because that's one of the questions a lot of people ask: will this be mandatory? And it cannot. We decided it could not be mandatory for 2 reasons. Because if we were to make it mandatory, 2 other entities would have had to have gotten involved, and that would have been the Ohio Bar Association and the Division of Real Estate. So again, we wouldn't be here today with a document if we brought those 2 entities in. Not that they're not fabulous entities, but they do tend to have their own positions on things that would have slowed us down. So we went forward with this document that is, you know, not a mandatory document. But as you'll see, if you haven't already seen, I imagine you might have already seen, if you've had some listings, some people might be already writing these. So we went through this whole process.
Can I ask you something, Wayne?
Sure.
Can I just what were a couple of the most difficult things to deal with?
Oh yeah.
And well,
Good
obviously we
question.
know the outcome because we have the document, but what were some of the hardest things to kind of slice up and figure out how we can do it the same way?
Taxes, how taxes are addressed in other parts of the state versus how they're addressed here. One huge area. Possession, because in some parts of the state, it is customary to give possession. The seller gets to keep the home for 30 days after title transfer. And in other parts of the state, they do round table closings and you don't get to keep it for a minute. So possession was another big issue of contention of what that was going to be. So those are 2 of the paramount areas that were definitely a big issue. And we spent much time on those 2 areas and collaboratively discussing those things. And thanks, Andrew, for asking the question. So today, for what we're going to do today, is I'm going to go through things, but at the same time, I would appreciate, you know, raising your hand, putting something in the chat, and Andrew's going to help be my co-pilot on that, I think, and see what we can do. But what we ended up with was this product that is now in January. It's been actually live since January. Now people are baby stepping their way into it, but there are certain brokerages in the area that are already using it. And we do use it in my brokerage, obviously. And so, but there are other Century 21 Home Stars using it. From what I understand, EXP is using it. And there are other brokerages. Berkshire Hathaway is training on it. I can tell you that Howard Hanna is being trained on it on a management level. They also will be using it. So you're going to be seeing it. And so the purpose of me getting together with you, as I've been doing with other offices, is first and foremost just to familiarize yourselves with it, because of the fact that if you're going to be seeing it, you'll want to understand it. The one thing I can tell you at the end of it, it is so much more comprehensive than the purchase agreements we've been using in the Northeast. We in the Northeast really have been a lot looser with our purchase agreements than anywhere else in the state. Because in Columbus and Cincinnati, and as well as in Dayton, they already have purchase agreements that are longer than this. They already had purchase agreements that were longer than this. So naturally, the length was always a concern for everyone, but so is the comprehension. And two of the things that we feel we did well with this document is, in the past, purchase agreements have always been drafted and lean towards the buyer. And the premise behind that is the buyer is writing the offer. The buyer is presenting the offer. But what we feel that's happened with this document is it is definitely a little bit weighted more equitably between the buyer and the seller. And because as we've seen that, that's the reason to have had the brokers as forming the offer, the purchase agreement, because we see all the landmines, right? We handle your problems with you. We hear all those issues. We get those complaints. So what we have seen, and you can probably attest to this yourself, particularly in the last 3 years of the market that we've been in, is that sellers have been in the driver's seat where it comes to inventory and sales price. But once we're under contract, the game seems to change and the buyer thinks the ball's in their court. And then they tend to hold the document hostage or try to renegotiate it. I'm sure some of you have seen that. So we have done what we hope to even the playing field, make it more equitable, and put this document more in the hands of the buyer and the seller, and stopping the ability to continually bring the brokers, their agents, and our companies into their debates. So there's a lot of that going on too. Any questions so far? All right. So I have a question before we get rolling, is have any of you experienced a document yet, seen it, or seen it on your listings or anything like that? Okay, maybe not.
I know as an office, we've definitely had it. I don't know if anybody on this call has, but we've definitely received them probably as long ago as June.
Yeah, I would think so. Right. So, okay, so what I'm going to do for the purposes of our time together, what I thought I would do, this is what I've been doing for a while now with some of these sessions I've been running in other people's offices, and I hope you're okay with that. So the document itself is 10 pages long. And if you go to ohiorealtors.org, these documents are available for you. When we're done with the Zoom, I'm going to forward Andrew everything we have so he can then disseminate it out to you how you guys want to see it. We wrote up a standard purchase agreement. We wrote 4 addendums additionally to that. And since then, there's been a buyer's agency agreement written. The forms committee at Ohio Realtors will now live on forever, and which is a great thing, because it was something the state really also needed. So that'll be that. So what I thought I would hit, and don't be alarmed when I say this number, because it sounds bigger than it is, but what I thought I would concentrate on when I do these offerings for people in our area is I concentrate on what are the differences in this document primarily that you should be aware of compared to what you're used to seeing in our area. Okay, because there are 10 pages of content, but some of it is very similar to what you already know. But I did ask the attorney for the state of Ohio, Stephen McCoy. He has since came up with a document. We will also forward that to Andrew, that has what we call 19 deadlines in the contract that I feel you should be aware of. And I've never sat down to count prior to this what our purchase agreement or what yours might have had. You might have already had as many as 10. So don't be alarmed by the 19. But these are 19 deadlines that I think you should definitely be aware of, because they could affect your buyer or your seller positively or negatively. So I'll weave in and out of other areas of the purchase agreement, but please, as I said, don't hesitate to stop me, raise your hand, ask some questions, and I'll be, toggling back between Andrew too for his assistance with this. So if it's okay with you, then we'll get started. So I'm using what I use in my office, my wingman, Nick Formica. He's on the call. So he kind of steers the plane while I'm talking. So we're going to put this up here so that you can see it. One of the documents that you'll see, this is the document that I use. This document is also available to you. This is the standard purchase agreement, but it is called the annotated version. And the annotated version is what you're seeing. It's highlighted in yellow. If we were in high school, when I went to high school, we might call it a cheat sheet or something like that, because the highlighted areas are the assist for you that give direction to you, and it also gives you rationale in some of the notated sections. I've encouraged my office, when they read this purchase agreement themselves for training, to read this version, because you might say, why is that like that? And there's a very good possibility that notated section might explain to you why that is like that, the rationale behind it. I've actually encouraged my agents to use this as a guide while they're writing an offer. I've encouraged my agents to use this and take it to their listing appointments and leaving it with their sellers even, because there's some extra areas in there that we haven't had to inform sellers about ahead of time. I tend to do the overkill version, so you'll see. So this is the first page of the purchase agreement, and a couple areas I want to point out to you that I think are critically important is on the top of it, you'll see Ohio Realtors logo, not Greater Cleveland, Greater Metropolitan, Keller Williams Greater Metropolitan. It doesn't say that. It says Ohio Realtors. This is a copywritten document. So the most important thing for you to understand is it cannot be altered. It should not be altered, because the onus of liability and responsibility lies within Ohio Realtors. Now, that doesn't mean things can't change, and I'll get into that as we go, or addendums aren't available. But for the purposes of this document, it's copywritten, and Ohio Realtors doesn't want you to alter it. We feel that we put enough areas in here to cover that it shouldn't be altered, but again, we'll get to some of that. Okay. Now, if
also, it would defeat the purpose of the document if it was altered. The
right,
whole point of it is uniform. So if
it
we all started
changes,
altering
yeah,
it, our own
it changes the
calculations.
integrity. It changes the integrity of the document. We've had that in my office, where in the past, I've had an agent who takes a house sale concurrency addendum and modifies it, that it ends up looking like a house sale contingency addendum. And I said, you just altered the integrity of the document. So that you changed the intent. So please don't do that. Okay. So if you look here on the first page, on lines, this is something we've never had before, everyone, but on lines 1 through 16 are terminology, a glossary. It's a glossary of words for your buyers and sellers to understand what does that mean, because we have a tendency as loan officers, as title people, to talk in our language, and they don't always know what we're talking about. So this is there for them. The one in particular I want to draw attention to you of for this purpose is number 8. If you look at number 8, it says broker includes without limitation the brokerages and any affiliated brokers and agents involved in this transaction, and shall include both the seller's broker and buyer's broker unless provided otherwise. In our current documents you might be using, very often you'll see the word agent in there, right? The agent has received the earnest money. The agent is not responsible for the residential property disclosure. This language here just swaps out the word agent and uses the word broker, but it also refers to you as the agent at the same time. It's interchangeable. Okay, so then if you see a number below 14, it talks about why that's there. It goes on, excuse me, it goes on in that section to mention, as our purchase agreements always have, that days mean calendar days. That wasn't always true in all parts of the state. So that's where you'll see some differences. Now here's a somewhat bigger difference than you might be used to. Under line 15, is the offer. It just talks about the offer right there. Okay. It addresses the property, further described as being. Under line 19, that's where you would write a single family residence with attached garage, a condominium unit. But again, you don't necessarily, that's not a mandatory field that has to be filled out. But we had those in our purchase agreement, some of us also, further described as being. So that's standard. Okay. Scroll down, if you don't mind, Nick, to line 20. So this is where it shows you the purchase price. This is where you'll write that. And we've added, for the sake of the industry change, in US dollars. You see that at the end, because we do have a lot of foreign purchasers, a lot of foreign money in the market these days. So that was added there. So what's next? So there's a little bit of a difference there, because with some of our standard purchase agreements, this would all be to the right, and then in the right-hand column, you would be writing earnest money, down payment, mortgage amount. Okay, we kind of removed that from this document because we've seen in recent times our agents stopped using those areas, right? They started writing in those sections of down payment and mortgage amount, TBD, minimum lender requirement. So it really wasn't being utilized. So we've kind of taken that out. Okay. So on line 21, this is where some things are a little bit different, but I think you're going to appreciate them. On line 21, it discussed what the form of payment is going to be. So under line 22A, line 22, which is 2A, it says here, initial here for cash. The buyer will pay the purchase price in cash at closing and agrees this contract is not contingent on financing. Nice, clean, simple, which we didn't really have it written that way in the past. Right there is where your buyer only initials there. Just, you know, we're kind of in the mindset that if a buyer's initialing something, a seller's also initialing it. That does not need to be initialed by the seller. That's the buyer's offer. They're initialing that they're paying cash. Okay, so now under 23, line 23, I want you to see this is a little bit of difference than what we're used to in the Northeast. But in the first section, within blank days, 3 days if left blank, you will see throughout this document that there are default dates there for areas where sometimes an agent misses the days to put in there. There will be a default date. We as brokers think that's super helpful because when we have to go and tie some things down, sometimes, as do you, we need to have a default date in there. So this is a little bit different than what we've been doing, and a lot of it's what the market's been dictating. But this goes on to say, after the date of acceptance of this contract, the buyer shall deliver to the seller or seller's broker evidence reasonably satisfactory to the seller that there are readily available liquid funds necessary to complete this transaction. If the buyer does not deliver such evidence within that time period indicated above, the evidence proved is not satisfactory to the seller may terminate this contract by delivering written notice to the buyer or the buyer's broker. Again, always pay attention to capital letters or bold font. And this is where it says the seller's failure to deliver the written notice of termination within 3 days of receipt of the evidence or 10 days after the date of acceptance of this contract, whichever occurs first, shall constitute a waiver of the seller's right to terminate pursuant to this provision. So this is a little bit of some oomph on the seller's part. Now, granted, in this fast-paced market we've been in, it's not unusual for you or the buyer's agent to show proof of funds when the offer is written. But we wrote this document to survive any market that we would be in. And so I would imagine that some of you could agree that when you've received proof of funds for listings that you've had, sometimes it's sent over to you in a text, in a screenshot, where you can't even read the people's names and stuff like that. So that's kind of why this was written, to give the opportunity. It could also be put, if you're writing an offer and you have the proof of funds, you could write 0 days right there because you're attaching the proof of funds. But this does give the opportunity. Sometimes you'll be writing offers on the weekend. The buyer doesn't have the proof of funds available. So there's some latitude in here for you as the buyer's agent, and there's some teeth in it for you as the listing agent. Okay. Okay. So now under 29, line 29, which is 2B, financing. This is where now we have some time elements in here for financing. Again, this is where the buyer would initial if they were financing. They're going to be obtaining financing to purchase the property. There's some other areas that we've added in here under 31, loan application within blank days, 7 days if left blank, blah, 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 that they will apply for their loan and pay any fees required at the time of application, including appraisal. Because many of us have seen that the buyers go in for their application, but won't give the appraisal money because they want to wait, till they get through the home inspection. But right here, they're signing that they're going to give their money for the appraisal. Let's move on. Okay. So then there's some other areas that are a little bit different here under 34. The buyer shall provide the seller or the seller's broker in writing with the name of the selected lender. Because again, we've gotten into the situation where sometimes they gave you a pre-approval and then they changed the lender. You as the listing agent are looking for that appraiser to call you. You call that lender says, hey, I didn't do that loan. So this puts right in here, they're under a requirement to give you the selected lender. And if requested, an intent to proceed notice. I'll get to that for you in a minute. The buyer shall act in good faith and with reasonable diligence to acquire loan approval by providing all necessary information and documentation to the lender during the mortgage loan application and approval process in a timely manner. And the buyer will maintain credit in good standing with funds to close. So we've added that. That was never in ours in the past. So then 39 is additional financing terms and conditions. For those of you that are more comfortable writing down payment, loan to value ratio, 39 and 40 are available for you to do that if that's the way you like to do business. Again, not required, but the opportunity is there.
Can I point out though that I've always been of the opinion, at least if you don't do that, you kind of damage your own client's financing contingency. Because if they're saying I'm going to buy this house and I'm going to put 20% down and there's no language about an appraisal problem, just because it doesn't appraise doesn't mean they can't buy it. But if you put the 20% in there, now you've kind of like added that to the financing contingency to say that that's the financing contingency that they have to be able to buy it with 20% down.
You're absolutely right. Now, and the flip side of that coin is some people might say, I want to make my buyer look stronger, and they're really going to put 50% on. So you can, but you're absolutely right, Andrew. That's it, because it ties them into it. If you write a minimum, if you write a percentage in, they can't put any less down without the contract being changed. Yeah. So you have the opportunity to do that if that's something you choose. And again, it's not required. Okay, so anyone else? We good? Okay, so if we move on to let's move on to we're still 2B. Are we in 2B still? Yes. Okay, so we got that. So now let's move on to paragraph 3. So this is new to our area, so I definitely want to point this out to you. So paragraph 3. Where is that at? Right there. Thank you, Nick. Line 57, number 3. So let's go through this real quick. Appraisal contingency. This contract is or is not contingent upon the property being appraised by a licensed appraiser at no less than the purchase price. If the property appraises at less than the purchase price, the buyer may terminate this contract by delivering written notice and a copy of the appraisal to the seller or the seller's broker no later than 5 days from the buyer's receipt of the appraisal. The parties may, at the party's option, use the applicable time period to reach an agreement as a result of the appraisal. Failure by the buyer to terminate this contract within the applicable time period constitutes a waiver of this contingency. If neither option is checked, this section doesn't apply. So if you're in a contentious market where you don't want that, your buyer doesn't want that to be a contingency, then it just doesn't apply. Okay. Paragraph 3 should be used in situations involving unique lender requirement or where a cash buyer wants to make their performance contingent on the property appraising at or above the contract price. If the appraisal is short, the buyer may terminate with written notice or attempt to reach an agreement. Deadlines are also critical here. So, that's another thing we haven't offered in our purchase agreements in the past. We haven't offered the availability for someone paying cash. We haven't had the verbiage written in the contract for a buyer paying cash to have the opportunity to make their offer contingent on an appraisal, which some of them in a less contentious market would like to do, right? So does
this paragraph also apply to people who are getting financing, or Correct. Is that understood by the financing contingency?
Well, that's yes and no. So that goes back to your point before this, which was a good point, Andrew. So one of the things that came into our market most recently, what are appraisal gaps, right? Appraisal gap addendums. As a broker, I don't love appraisal gap addendums because we actually finally wrote one in our office because of the fact that do people really understand what, we'll bridge an appraisal gap, but really, okay, did anybody verify they really have the money to bridge it? Do the people agreeing to it know what that really even means? So we were a little loose with that in the beginning while we were riding shotgun, trying to just throw these offers out there. So in most situations, even with conventional transactions, the loan more than likely sometimes can't be approved even if the house doesn't appraise. We've been conditioned in our minds to believe FHA and VA are the only gauntlet throwers for that. But really, it's the lender's decision anyways. This does amp it up a little by giving the buyer the opportunity to not proceed if it doesn't appraise, regardless of who the financing's with. But again, it doesn't have to
be a good idea with financing to be checking is there.
Correct. Right.
And not treat it like it's already implied up above.
Correct. And so the other thing is like, let's say you're in a multiple offer situation and your seller receives this offer And they really, and it does say the contract that is being financed and the seller, and it says it is contingent on the appraisal. And the seller says, I have 5 offers here. I really like this offer best, but I really don't want it to be contingent on their appraisal. So your seller merely counters back with, it is not contingent, and that's their counter offer. I would work with this buyer, but I'm not accepting your terms of that, because those are just negotiable check marks, right? Like any other purchase agreement. But it does give the opportunity for it there. So, but it is one of those, I call them trigger points, that you as an agent want to be aware of. So any of these areas that give the buyer or the seller the opportunity to move away from the transaction, then what you're going to want to do, depending on who you represent, is you're going to want to stay involved to make sure your client is best represented in their deadlines. Because there are times, like for example, where a seller might have a backup offer, right? And they are asking, if can I get out of this purchase agreement, where there are a few trigger dates in here that will help them do that if the buyer hasn't performed. And one of them we'll get to is earnest money. But you'll see, and then there are times when a buyer might want to get out because the seller is not willing to do some things. Again, this will give them the opportunity, but for a short window of time, not up until the date of title transfer. That's why the one positive and negative about this document is it will really keep the agents very much involved in this transaction from contracts to close. Okay. Any other questions? Are y'all doing okay? Okay. So that was the appraisal contingency. So now let's go to paragraph 6, which is earnest money. I'm sorry, Nick, I lied. Let's hit, if you could just scroll down a little, let's stay on 69, on line 69 for a minute, because this is different too. This is not a deadline, but I wanted you to make aware of it. Settlement charges. This is pre-written because some of our purchase agreements didn't have it, and you're always kind of adding that language yourself, or perhaps yours has it, I'm not sure. But seller agrees to pay actual settlement charges. In this case, we call them in our area closing costs, everyone. Incurred by the buyer, including but not limited to discount points, closing costs, documented prepaids, lender's policy of title insurance, and any other fees allowed by the buyer's lender in the amount not to exceed blank. If no amount is entered, the amount shall be 0. And so that's just kind of, that's pre-written for you. So now you have the closing cost language in the document. Okay. So let's talk about earnest money, which is paragraph 6. This is a meaty section, and there are some definite differences, but based on what we're used to in our area. So if you don't mind and could bear with me, I'm going to read us through this. I'll read us through the annotated portion, and then I, welcome some comments from you. But one of the things we as brokers have seen in the past is this situation where we get under contract and the buyer won't deposit their earnest money, even though contractually it says they have to. But there, and contractually it does. But if you speak to outside attorneys, you really don't get to. We in our area didn't have an automatic trigger to cancel if they didn't. So that's in here now. Line 73, number 6. No later than blank days, 3 days if left blank, after the date of acceptance, the buyer shall deliver an EMD, earnest money deposit, in the amount of whatever your earnest money is going to be, which shall be held by the following third party. Here it's called the holder. Andrew, do you all deposit earnest money to title companies now at your brokerage?
Yeah, we hold earnest money maybe a dozen
So
times.
this is the title company's name. There's, in this purchase agreement versus our others, there are 2 places that the title company's name will be put in. This is one place. You'll see it again later. And like I always tell our agents, please put the same title company, otherwise it's confusing. So this is the holder. If a third party other than an Ohio broker is designated to hold the EMD, the parties agree to execute any escrow agreement required by the holder, the terms of which may supplement but not conflict with this paragraph. I'm going to stop there for a minute because you may not be aware of this, but many of the title companies we all work with do send a document to your buyers authorizing they're allowed to hold that paper, that earnest money early in a transaction. You just might not be aware of that because it doesn't come to you, but it's common practice. Okay, line 77. Within 5 days after the EMD deadline indicated above, the buyer or the buyer's broker shall provide written confirmation to the seller or the seller's broker that the buyer has made the EMD by the date required. If such confirmation is not received by this date, the seller may terminate this contract by delivering written notice of termination to the buyer or the buyer's broker within 3 days after the confirmation of the EMD was required, or at any time prior to receiving confirmation that the EMD has been made. I'll come back to that. The EMD shall be deposited in the holder's trust account. Unless agreed otherwise by parties in writing, the EMD shall be dispersed at closing by the holder in the following ways. So now lines 81 through 89 are the standard language you already have in your purchase agreements you've been working with. Talks about how the earnest money gets returned, with a mutual release, a court order, or 2 years and 1 day if nobody ever did anything. So that language is the same. But I want to point this out here. So the notated version, in many areas of Ohio, it is common for earnest money to be held by a title company or other third party rather than a broker in a transaction. This section is drafted to account for this possibility by referring to the term holder. If the holder is not a broker, this section requires the parties to sign an escrow agreement. However, the terms of disbursement mirror the requirements for the brokers under Ohio's license law. Note, buyer's broker must provide written confirmation that the EMD has been deposited to the seller's broker. This notice must be furnished within 5 calendar days. Failure to do so can result in the seller terminating the contract. So now let's just say that it said 3 days that earnest money would be deposited. So first of all, it is the way this is written, the buyer's agent is responsible to get written notification and give it to the listing agent that the earnest money has been deposited. So I will tell you that in the trainings in my office early on, we brought our title partner in. Our title partner is Ohio Real Title and Title Professionals. We partner with Venture Title. They both learned this with us. They both now have handouts that talk about where title is involved in this document. But what they told us is that if you're electronically depositing earnest money with them, I'm not going to speak for every title company. I feel they're all very similar. But if the buyer's electronically wire transferring earnest money to their facility, that is time-stamped. So if they have 3 days to do it, remember what I said, 3 calendar days. So if you do it on a Friday, they have Fridays. Also in this contract, it tells you if today is the date of acceptance, Friday is the date of acceptance, the first day begins 12:01 a.m. Saturday. That's your first day after acceptance. That's written in here also. So they have Saturday, Sunday, Monday to deposit their earnest money, right? 3 days. So they might electronically wire it there on Saturday or Sunday. So when the title company opens up on Monday, they'll have a timestamp of when that money was received so that you can prove it was received during that time. I encourage you, at least in our office, to then send that immediately to the listing agent so they have proof, to upload it into our loop so that we have proof, and there's the proof. Now, if the 3 days go by and they have not deposited that money, within 5 days after that, the seller can void the contract. Okay. The way this is written, the seller can also void the contract if the buyer, but they have a full 5 days to do it. If the buyer even deposits the money on the 4th, 5th, 6th day, the seller still has authority legally to void this contract because they didn't deposit it within the 3 days. So I just want to bring that to your attention. This is another one of those examples where a seller might exercise that right if the money wasn't deposited, if they received a backup offer that was better. And you can argue this either way, but you can see where this purchase agreement will benefit a buyer and a seller in certain positions. Our goal was just to keep the transaction moving, not to get people to void these purchase agreements. It was really just to keep the buyer and seller in the transaction and having them perform the way that they're supposed to perform. Does anybody have any questions on that section? I do want you to
Thank
know, well, before you say that, one thing I want to mention, I'm sorry, the Division of Real Estate, now they're not in here, they're not in this document, but in the eyes of the Division of Real Estate, it is your responsibility as an agent in the transaction, regardless who you represent, to verify that their earnest money was collected. So for example, if you are the listing agent and the buyer agent isn't getting you this information, you're still responsible to check with the title company to see if it was deposited. Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead. What's your question?
No problem. Two quick questions. One, in our other purchase agreement, it was standard that it was 4 days. Are a lot of people still going to just be writing 4 days, or are we kind of moving to 3 days at this point as a standard for earnest money?
I'm not going to speak for Andrew, but I would say that the industry in our area probably will still write 4 days conditionally.
Okay.
You know, some people might want to
There's a
write 2
blank
days.
there, so you can
Yeah.
write whatever you want there. The three is the default if it's blank.
Right.
So, I think 4 is what everybody around here expects, and I think 4 is I don't know. I feel like 4 is fair because 3 means if it is a Friday, you kind of don't have any weekday time to do it.
And I think that's why 4 was born when it was born, because it was born in a time period when we didn't forward it to the title companies. But also, Jamie, I think in a situation where there are agents in the industry who really don't want their buyers to deposit earnest money until after they do a home inspection, right? So that agent might write 10 days there. So, and again, that will become a negotiable item for the seller to go back to if they choose to.
Right. Okay, thank you. Other quick question. In the settlement charges section, I believe on our other purchase agreement, there was information in there about like 1/2 the cost of something
This
having to
isn't
do with
that.
title.
This
is
isn't
different?
that. This is that one line in our contract right under the purchase price, earnest money, and all that, and then it says seller to
Oh.
pay X in buyer closing costs. That's what that is.
Okay, because all of a sudden I'm getting a lot of pushback about RESPA and this closing cost stuff. So I don't know if that's addressed somewhere in here.
So
Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, about
Yes.
choosing the title company, which I've always been told is a negotiated item, and now I'm getting buyer's agent pushing back that we can't force them to use a title company, which obviously we're not forcing them. They can choose not to work with us, but that if their attorneys are telling them and their title companies are telling them that there's RESPA rules about the seller can't decide the title company and stuff like that. And I've been told by our attorney that because our purchase agreements say that we pay half of that insurance that we're protected, and that it's not the case or something like that.
I mean, it's a negotiated item. I would. This is purely my principles on this. It's not real, but buyers should pick title companies. That just is the way it should be. But that there's no laws or rules around that. I would say the only time the seller has grounds to pick the title company is when they're paying any amount of the buyer's closing costs.
Right, and that's kind of customary. There's Jamie. That's a great question, and there's RESPA rules, there's mandates, and then there's what we're used to doing customary in our area. So they kind of all intertwine, and they do get confusing. So I can understand that. So also to your point on 69 is that discusses the buyer's settlement charges. Later in the document, you'll see where the sellers are. But this was written to be in the title area will show you that the fees of the title policy and stuff are split 50-50 as we get further into this. So it's all balanced out through here as we're used to it, just in 3 different sections, which is what we're not used to.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Anyone else? Okay, so the earnest money section is a little bit different, but definitely tighter, more comprehensive than what we're used to, and has some, has some good bones to it, in my opinion. So now I just want to focus.
It's fantastic that all through here the seller gets a choice to cancel an agreement because a buyer didn't do something, where that was kind of implied in all of our purchase agreements forever. And the fact that it's real now in here is pretty excellent.
Yeah, because you're absolutely right. It was implied, and what is implied but gray, and then gray causes attorneys to have to be involved. So we've also tried to eliminate more legal arguments between people and the need for them to have to hire outside attorneys. Well, one reason is because for some reason they think we're the attorneys, right, guys? Constantly. Okay, so I just, now I want to point out another section. Again, it's not a trigger date or anything like that, but I think it's something you're not used to that you might like. So starting on line 90, fixtures and equipment. Here what we've done is we've added a lot of things. This was a conversation we had for a long time, but we've added a lot of things. So from line 90, the property, these items, if they're fixed, should stay. That goes all the way through line 151. And then it goes on to say in 152, the following checked equipment is also included, but you then have to check it because a dishwasher isn't affixed, a dryer isn't affixed, but they're plug-in, so they could be removed. So that's your standard you're used to, right? Then 164 gives you the opportunity to add anything else like we have always had. 165 gives you the opportunity to exclude things like we always could. And then 166, we added this because we were actually starting to see this around the state. The following checked equipment is leased by the seller and is not included. And there are some items that are leased. So remember the beginning when I said I've been encouraging our agents to take this document on listing appointments with them. It's a great time for them to ask, are any of these items leased in your home? Which I think in the past, the one that we used to always ask was, a water conditioning system or a softener, but we didn't always ask some of these other things, which I have to laugh because about a year and a half ago, I got a call from one of our agents who's had a buyer buy a house. They had already been in the house for 9 months. And all of a sudden a company pulled up, knocked on their door and wanted to take their shed out of their yard because apparently the previous seller had leased that shed, not disclosed it to anybody and stopped paying on it. So those are some crazy things that we hear, right, Andrew? So
Never heard of leasing a shed.
I had not either.
A hot water tank, right?
Right. So now here in this notated section, this talks about all the section above it. Many disagreements arise determining what is and was not considered a fixture. The biggest argument I think we see is in half baths, powder rooms, right, with mirrors. Is it on a hook? Is it screwed in the wall? Ohio law defines fixtures as tangible personal property that has become permanently attached or affixed to the land or structure. A good rule of thumb is to imagine turning the property upside down, and what stays in place as being attached to the land or the structure could be considered a fixture. So I just want you to pay attention to those things. That was our attorney who helped us as his opinion of humor at that point. So, okay. So our next section that we're going to hop over to is inspections and tests, which is paragraph 9.9 and 9B. So just like Earnest Money, we're trying to, again, add some commitment to our purchase agreement in the inspection section. So under 9, let me thank you, Ann. Thank you, Nick. Let me hit on 9 period, because the top part is not a trigger date. 9B is. So let me just show you what's different here in the inspection section. So one thing we changed here, and again, keeping in mind that the current market we're in might not sustain this, where a lot of buyers are still waiving inspections or they're doing informational only inspections. So this is what we're talking about long term. Again, bold font with capital letters, which really makes us catch our eye. So on 181, talks about which inspections they're going to get. So here you're going to have an either or choice that we haven't had in the past. So starting with line 185, 9A, the parties agree that the following inspections and tests can be performed. 186 is number 1, any inspections and tests desired by the buyer at the buyer's sole discretion. So your buyer might want to get 1, 2, or 10 tests. This means they don't have to identify which ones they want. They can just get any, and the seller's giving them permission in the amount of days that they get to get their tests, inspections. Or 188, the following marked items, and then you have it, your standard ones you've had before that the buyer could make a choice of. In addition to the foregoing marked items, the buyer shall have the right to perform any additional inspections recommended by an inspector based on the results of the inspection selected above. Such additional inspections shall be performed in the inspection period, other than those recommended by an inspector based on the results of an inspection selected above. The buyer does not select an inspection or test listed above. They waive the right to that inspection. That wasn't necessarily in our documents before. So for example, if your buyer chooses to use 188, section 188, if they don't check radon, they've waived the right to it. So your seller does not have to allow it. That was, again, as Andrew said, in the past that had been implied, but it really wasn't stated. So now it's clearly stated that if they didn't check it, they don't get to have it. Okay, so now if you go into inspection period on 205-9B, inspections and or tests must be completed no later than, this is where you put however many days you all want to have, 10 days if left blank from the date of acceptance of the contract, which is considered the inspection period. If the buyer does not complete an inspection during the inspection period, that inspection test shall be deemed waived. Now, this is a little bit different. Request to remedy or termination. Request to remedy is also removal of contingency in our verbiage. Buyer may only terminate this contract for material defects, which includes, but is not limited to, those defects or conditions which impact the health, safety, habitability, use, or value of the property. Buyer may not terminate this contract for non-material conditions such as routine maintenance and cosmetic issues. Don't we all love that? That one deserves a round of applause, I think. Because it's clearly stated when the buyer is signing this agreement that they're aware that that's true, right? So now this area is a little bit different right here. If the inspections or tests identify material defects, a buyer may, on or before the end of the inspection period, either terminate this contract or provide the seller with a request to remedy the defects. Again, for us, that's an ROC. A notice of termination or request to remedy must be delivered in writing to the seller or the seller's broker and must be accompanied by a copy of the relevant pages of the inspections, tests, or reports specifying the material defects. Failure of the buyer to provide a notice of termination or a request to remedy on or before the inspection period constitute the buyer's acceptance of the condition of the property and shall be a waiver of the buyer's right to terminate pursuant to this provision. So if the buyer's agent, again, doesn't get you that information, then the contract can be terminated and the seller, again, could move on to that secondary offer or put their house back on the market. 216, if the buyer delivers a request to remedy any material defect not previously disclosed by the seller, the parties shall have blank days, 3 days if left blank, to reach a written agreement, the remedy period. The remedy period shall end upon the parties' execution of a written agreement regarding the requested remedy. If the parties do not enter into a written agreement by the end of the remedy period, this contract shall terminate unless the buyer withdraws the request to remedy in writing prior to the end of the remedy period. Nothing in this section precludes the buyer from terminating this contract by delivering written notice to the seller before the expiration of the remedy period. Upon termination, the earnest money will be dispersed as appropriately. Now hold your questions if you have any for a minute. 222, licensed inspector. If a home inspection as defined by Ohio Revised Code is conducted, it shall be performed by a home inspector licensed by the Ohio Department of Commerce. An inspection or test of only specific single component of the property may be performed by a qualified or credentialed professional in that field who does not perform an entire or partial home inspection outside their area of expertise or credential. The buyer assumes the sole responsibility to select and retain a licensed and qualified inspector and releases the broker of any liability regarding this section. I want to go on a little bit more. Under 227, buyers shall pay the cost of all inspections or tests. Again, that can be negotiated if that's not how your people want it. 228, this is the only thing, guys, point of sale is still in here, that has to be point of sale compliant. The only item in the entire contract that John Deegan and I had to force them to add that we insisted they have, and that is because we are the only area in the entire state of Ohio that does point of sale inspections. And the other parties in the state didn't want it in there because they didn't want people in their area to start to think they should start to get them. But we insisted it had to be in there. So that was one. So then this is also new, 239G damages. The buyer shall be responsible for the repair of any damages caused by the buyer's inspections and tests. Repair shall be completed in a timely and workmanlike manner at the buyer's expense. That was added for a couple reasons. One reason is because a lot of buyers don't attend a home inspection, right? And something might be broken in the property from the home inspector and the seller wants it fixed and the buyer says, well, it's not their fault. Well, now they're responsible to make sure their inspector doesn't break anything. Okay. Then this goes on to explain that a little bit more. And that's that section there. The one thing that's a trigger date for you to be aware of is that if you put in there, the inspection will be completed in 10 days. It could be voided if you, this contract could end up being voided if you show up on the 10th day for the inspection and that particular inspection doesn't get them a report for 2 to 3 days. Because you only have the amount of days of the inspection period to have completed these things and get back to them. So that's a trigger date that we're also a little bit not used to. Comments, questions, Andrew?
I was going to point out what you just said, just that there is not an amount of days after the last inspection, and that's what we certainly all are accustomed to here. So your inspection period is it. That's all you get.
Now, it doesn't mean you can't ask for extensions. You can, but either party has the right to terminate based on how it's originally written.
But it would make it feel more like 10 days is our 7. So.
Right.
Exactly.
Exactly
If you see
right.
one that's 10 days, you don't necessarily need to feel like, oh, this is way longer than I'm used to. It's really about the same amount of time.
Correct. You're absolutely, that's a great point. Nobody's brought that up yet. Thank you for that. And the other thing is you're going to want to make sure they choose an inspector that turns the report around. And it's also going to cause these inspectors to have to turn these around a little bit more timely for some of us, right? Okay. Anyone else have any questions on that? Okay. So now if we go to paragraph 14. Should have taken my Dramamine. Okay. Okay. Now this section is different. So this is called Owners Association, which also, let's get this question on the chat. What's it say, Andrew? Can you look at the chat?
It just came up.
Yeah, it did. I know.
So yeah, it says, so with this, we don't have 3 days to submit an ROC after the last inspection. That's correct.
Correct.
You have the inspection period to submit an ROC.
Right. But again, they could ask for an extension, just like you've had to in the past, because you have to get estimates or whatever. It would just be worked out separately in an ROC. It's removed subject to an extension for the time period to receive estimates or whatever. So that part's the same, but this one kind of channels it differently. So now another question. Is there another one, Andrew? Or?
Nope, that was it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. So Owners Association. Now, again, this is where it's a little bit different for us. For us, that's traditionally only condominium associations mostly, right? In other parts of the state, they have housing developments, not unlike in the state of Florida, gated communities, cluster home settings like that. And we have some of those, but this is what this is. So here's what this talks about. I'm not going to read this whole section to you, but we're going to talk about it. If the property is a condominium unit governed by a condominium association is located within a community governed by a homeowners association, the seller shall provide the buyer with the following information and documents within blank days, 7 days if left blank, after the date of acceptance of the contract. This area will replace the condominium addendum many of us have used in the past, right? So, but I'm gonna skip the middle and go to the review period. The buyer's obligations are contingent upon satisfactorily reviewing upon a satisfactory review of the documents requested above. If the buyer is not provided some or all of the requested documents or is not satisfied with any of the requested documents, the buyer, as the buyer's sole remedy, may deliver a written notice of termination to the seller, and the EMD shall be dispersed. Again, in bold font, the buyer's failure to deliver the written notice of thanks, Nick. Termination within 7 days of receipt of the requested documents or 14 days after the date of acceptance of the contract, whichever occurs first, shall constitute a waiver of the buyer's right to terminate pursuant to this provision. This provision does not limit the buyer's right to object to matters set forth in the title commitment. Now, if you could scroll backwards again, Nick, for a minute. So I want to read this notated section. Paragraph 14 only applies to properties subject to owners associations such as condominiums or homeowners associations. The seller's broker is encouraged to discuss association documents with the seller early in the process. This paragraph is drafted to create an obligation for sellers to provide important association documents so the buyer can determine key information pertaining to the association and the property, such as their solvency, upcoming assessments, rules, and regs, which may impact a buyer's decision to purchase. The buyer will have 7 days to review and provide a notice of termination 14 days after acceptance. The buyer has questions with respect to the documents. It's recommended they consult an attorney. Now in 287 through 306, we're gonna think in our area, there's a lot of overkill in there. And I want you to know this, John Deegan actually wrote this section, and he was passionate about it reading this way. And his rationale behind that is that it is really an obligation between the seller and the buyer to get these documents together, not the agents. And I don't know about you, Andrew, but in our office, we have a closed Facebook page, and I will periodically see, hey, does anybody have the decks and bylaws for Lockwood Ridge condominiums? And then we're such a great company, right? I do, I'll share them with you. But as the broker, the hair goes up on the back of my neck because I think to myself, wow, I wonder if those are current, or were those written in 1987 that they're passing. And so, and as service-oriented individuals, as you are as agents, you always want to be doing everything you can to be helping the seller. I'll get them for you. I'll do that for you. Let me go get them for you. This section here takes that responsibility out of our hands and places it in the hands of the buyer and the seller where it really should be. So it is our inherent need and desire to serve, but this removes that liability from us.
One thing I think is I remember from the first time I saw this section, felt like the one concern I have about it, and I almost feel like you need to demand something in writing from the seller to say, of all of these things listed, these are all of the things that I can get from the association, right? Because of the fact that in the review period, it makes it clear that the buyer can decide they don't want to move forward because they didn't get something in that list.
Right, which is
And I think
exactly
it's
why I
important
mentioned I take it to a listing appointment. I would take that. I would take this on a listing, even if you guys aren't going to use this purchase agreement, which is fine. I would take this on a listing and give this to a seller and say, these are items that the buyer very well likely might be asking you for. I encourage you to get them now.
Yeah. But to have something in writing acknowledging this is everything that we can get and give to you, so that the buyer can't 5 days later decide like, I don't like this place as much as I thought I did. I'm just going to back out because I didn't get the most recent reserve study.
Exactly.
that may not exist, right?
Exactly. Okay, you guys good with that? Any questions there? Okay.
No, just to love that. That's all.
Thank you. We'll take that. We'd like to feel some love with this. All right, great. Okay, so now we're going to move on to paragraph 16E, deed and conveyance. Let me just see if we missed anything in a second. Okay, 16E. Scroll up for 1 second.
Well, no, the stuff that Noreen's overlooking is all stuff that's similar.
Yeah,
to our
right. This
to our contract.
Thanks for saying that, but line 349, 16D, we don't usually have this in our purchase agreements, who they should make the deed to. So there you go. There's one I haven't added. So you want to say that one for sure. Okay. All right. So now we're gonna let me just see for 1 second. Okay, so also scroll up just a little bit more, Nick. So also an area that was not mentioned before that doesn't have a trigger date, but in here in this section about title, it talks about that in line 338. You guys, I'm not sure how much you see it. We might see it a little bit more out in the rural areas closer to where we are, but this identifies if they're aware of timber rights, mineral rights, rights that have to be transferred. We vaguely mentioned it in the past, but it's definitely mentioned more in this section here. Okay, so back to 16E. Okay, so in the standard and customary with our purchase agreements now, most of them read, if there's a defect of the title, it's pre-written that the seller has 30 days to remove that defect. This is different here. In the event of a title defect prevents the seller from conveying marketable title on the date of closing, the buyer and seller mutually agree to extend the closing by blank days. 7 is the default day here, okay? You could write 30 if you're more comfortable, and then it goes on to say the same language as we've had in the past about how they could accept it. It provides the parties the ability to automatically extend the closing date to resolve title defects in order for the seller to convey marketable title. If the number of days inserted is 0, the contract must close on the date provided. Buyer has the options, as they always have. The reason we wrote it this way, because 30 days seemed to be a problem for some people when we gave the seller the ability to have 30 days to remove it, because sometimes and especially in the volatile times we're in right now, the buyer may lose their loan rate and the rate may adjust high and they're being penalized because the seller had a cloud on the title. So that's why, but whatever number you all agree on is fine. Otherwise, 7 is the default date there. Okay. Then to kind of to Jamie's point earlier, in here is a different section that we're used to, okay, which starts on 354 through 365. I'm going to go to the notated version section and then I'll go back. Because of variations in local practice regarding the handling of title insurance policies and purchase contracts, the parties are provided options with respect to the type of title policy and payment of title policy. ALTA refers to the American Land Title Association as policies are used throughout Ohio. It's strongly recommended that the seller's broker provide the fully executed contract to the respective title agent as soon as possible following the date of acceptance. That's standard. But here's what's a little bit different. Ours was pre-written before. This is different. So as a broker of a different office, I would encourage you in your office to talk to the title company that you're in partners with and see their opinion on it. As I mentioned, Ohio Real Title Professionals, they wrote a document guiding our agents. And what it is that we are encouraged to check the first box under 359 for the ALTA policy. That's how it's always been customarily done here. That's why I'm guiding you that way. And then here on 363, the seller shall pay 50% of the amount. Those are the two areas that we've customarily done business as in the past. So if you want to continue to do business the way we have been doing it customarily, that's where that would be checked. Otherwise, I would encourage Andrew in your office to go ahead and talk with your title people and see how they want to address that. I would also, like I said, I've been bringing them into a lot of our training. So they went straight to their underwriters. They went straight to their owners to figure out how to guide us. But that's the standard way we've done business in the past. Okay. Any questions there? Oh, is there something in the chat, Andrew? Is that? No, nope. Thank you.
No,
Okay.
just another. I love that too.
Thank you. I keep spreading the love. Okay. So on 366, which is 16B, I'm sorry, it's not 16B. I lost my spot. It is 18B. Don't have my bifocals on. So 18B, this gives the opportunity to a buyer if they would like to ask for a stake survey. We've never offered that before. We've just done location surveys. So that's what that area address. It's either is or is not contingent if somebody wants a boundary line survey, which is a stake survey. I'm sure you'll agree that so many of our buyers, when they think they're paying for a survey from their lender, they think they're getting a stake survey. They don't realize it's just a visual. So that just kind of addresses it there. 373 addresses FIRPTA with foreign investments. This addresses if the seller is a foreign person. They have to go forward to be able to show that who they are so that the IRS can follow them. We've not addressed FIRPTA in the past, but again, it's become more prevalent as we've gotten foreign investors in our marketplace. Paragraph 20, Nick, is our next one. Closing. This is different. We're coming up some more differences. So hang in there. And I have us go until 12:30. So if you can hang with me, I shouldn't. There's no reason I shouldn't get us done. So on 378, on number 20, closing. This contract shall be performed, and this transaction shall be closed on a date mutually agreed upon by the parties in writing, but in no event later than with a date. That's a drop dead date. That's not on or about, on or before. In case we get the date met, we might not. For purposes of this contract, the parties agree that the transaction will be considered to have closed when the following has occurred. So you're going to only initial one of these. The buyer's only going to initial one of these. In our area, again, I don't want to speak for you, but in our area, I'm training our agents to check 381. That is what's normal and customary in our area. 383 applies more to roundtable closings. But in 381, the language is a little bit different because remember, we used to say when the title is transferred, but you might remember during COVID, that changed when we couldn't title transfer at the courthouse. So now your title companies will typically say it's funded. They don't always say it's title transferred. So on 381, all necessary documents have been signed by all required parties and the transaction is funded. That's where the gap insurance comes in place that you probably all are aware of. But for our area in Northeast Ohio, 381 would be the area you would check. Okay. Okay, so then that goes on again to explain about roundtable closings. So now, paragraph 21, possession. We added this, which is different than what we've had in the past. And again, it's not mandatory you use this section if it's not something you're comfortable with. But in paragraph 21, possession shall be provided to the buyer according to one of the following checked options. At closing, 392, blank, if you're going to give them like 5 days following the closing. And 393 is if they're going to stay longer. Okay. And 390, like they're going to stay 12 days, 14 days, do rent back. Okay. So now under 394, if the seller maintains possession of the property after closing, it is recommended that the parties enter into a post-closing possession addendum. That addendum is or is not attached. That is one of the additional documents we're going to provide you with that we wrote. It's a very comprehensive approach to letting them stay in the house, not as a landlord-tenant situation, but in that period of time after it closes till they give up possession. Again, I would encourage you to use it if you want to, but you don't need to. It's not mandatory. It's not necessary to be checked. So paragraph 24 is going to replace our walkthrough addendums that we've had in the past, some of us. So property maintenance, while the seller is in possession, the seller.
Can you go back up for 1 second?
I skipped it. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Just it's because this is something that we had happen numerous times over the last few years, but line 396 and 397 is helpful for the scenario where sellers don't leave.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you, Andrew. I wanted to mention
the fact that like seller agrees that any expenses that are incurred for them not following the contract that they will owe. Obviously, if a person's going to stay in a house when they're not supposed to, you're probably going to have to sue them to get that. But at least the contract is blatantly obvious that they will owe that money.
And it gives an attorney some teeth too if they need it, right?
Yeah.
So I'm glad you're pointing that out. Thank you. 398 addresses property maintenance and debris if they leave it all there, which is things we haven't expounded on in ours in the past. So 405 line 24 paragraph 24 replaces the final verification as the walkthrough addendum. The buyer shall have the right to make final verification of the property within blank days, 2 days if left blank, prior to the execution of closing documents and confirm that it's all and the repairs have been done. This goes on paragraph 25 to discuss if there's damage done. It's again more lengthy than we've had before about what to do if damage occurs on the property. And then you can scroll down, Nick, from there. And then, right, the buyer could have the right to terminate just like before, but they are required to let them know. There's a lot more language in here if the property is damaged of the seller's responsibility to make the buyer aware. Okay. And like paragraph 28 addresses flood insurance. We'll slow down 1 second, Nick. Okay, there's the home warranty stuff, your typical fair housing information. And then 434 addresses flood hazard area, which, we've talked about briefly in the past in our purchase agreements. But again, this puts the onus of responsibility on the buyer to find out if the house is in a flood zone, not just the seller to tell them, because of the flood insurance that they might need for it. Okay. Now if we go to paragraph 39, let me just see if I want anything else here. Let's stop at 33, compliance with dates. Time is of the essence. Those words have never been in our purchase agreements in the past. Time is of the essence and the date set forth in this contract. This means the parties must perform by the dates provided for in this contract to be binding. Any agreements to modify, extend, or waive any of the dates provided must be in writing and agreed to by all parties. Okay, we haven't had that before. And then now if you go down, Nick, to, let's see what's next. This is another area. This again doesn't have a trigger to it, but I want you to be aware of it. Another area that John Deegan requested. Paragraph 34, dispute resolution. This right here, by the buyer and seller signing the purchase agreement, has them agree to try to arbitrate an issue before they go to attorneys. And that would be low grade arguments, not something that is fraud or anything like that. And that's stated right in there. You have lines here on 470 to add additional terms where you might add if there's something else you want to say, okay, for there. And then I want to scroll down to 40 in that area. So we'll go to signatures first. Okay. So under 37, signatures, only manual or electronic signatures of the parties' contract documents shall be valid for purposes of this contract, and any written amendments or required notices. For purposes of this provision, electronic communication, for example, but not limited to email messages or text messages made by a party or a broker, are not considered terms of this contract and are not binding on the parties. This contract may be executed in one or more counterparts, which we've had that before. There's been a lot of arguments in recent years that my agent let me know that my offer was accepted because the other agent texted them that it was accepted, but it had not yet been delivered. It has to be delivered, fully executed and delivered for it to be accepted. So that's why that was added. So now if we go to paragraph 39, and that's where in acceptances, that's what we talk about, the delivery of it. Duration of the offer. This is different. We haven't had this, and it's not required to be used. So if you're not comfortable, you don't have to use it. This offer is open for acceptance until blank date, blank time, unless withdrawn before that. Now, this section here talks about both of them in both of their sections. As a buyer, it's important to read and understand the offer before signing below. By signing below, the buyer fully understands and approves this offer, is of legal age and capacity, has authority to enter into this contract, and any additional signatures, including that of a spouse or otherwise, who are necessary in order to purchase the property or obtain financing, have agreed to sign, okay? And then if you go down the line below it, under 500, this is different. The very first line for signature for both the buyer and the seller offer an entity, an LLC, a POH, an executor. That's where they would put that entity's name. And then the buyer would sign. And that's what, and those sections are available just that way for the signatures of both of them. And you see in the notated section, it says why. For buyers signing as entities, it is recommended the entity name be printed, followed by the signature of the authorized person. For trusts or POAs, same thing. So that line was added that we haven't had in the past. So under 501, the action of the seller, it's the same thing. You're legally available to, you're legally old enough, etc., to sign. Now on line 506, 507, or 508, this is different. 506, checkbox, initial. The seller would check or initial. The seller accepts the buyer's offer and agrees to convey the property according to the terms and conditions herein. 507, the seller rejects the buyer's offer. And then 508, the seller counteroffers according to modifications attached as a counteroffer addendum or is modified herein via electronic signature. The counteroffer is open for acceptance, and they can put a date and time in there if they choose to do that. We've also, one of the other documents we can provide you with, and Andrew, if you choose to not use this document, but use your continued purchase agreement, you could still use some of those other interchangeable documents if you'd like to. We've provided a counter offer addendum. It's an addendum that has lines spelling out what the counter offer is, because as some of you know, you do a lot of negotiating on the phone, email, text, and then sometimes it could get missed one or two of the items into the counter offer electronically. You can also modify this and do this document to make the counter offer. You don't have to use the counter offer addendum. It's just an assist if somebody would want it. But for these times that we're in, multiple offers where often the buyers aren't convinced that their offers had been presented to the sellers. This last page is also an assist, because what you can say to the listing agent, if you use this document, if they rejected my offer, then you just have to have the seller check the box on 507 and sign the purchase agreement. That will prove to my buyer that the seller saw the offer, because we've had that issue a lot lately, right? And I think that's it. Is that it, Nick? Are we done at that? Is that the end of it? Oh, no, we also have here, we added the release of dower. So if the seller is married and the seller's spouse is not a party to this contract, by signing below, the seller's spouse hereby agrees to sign a separate release of his or her dower interest in the property no later than the date of closing. And any questions regarding a spouse's dower interest should be referred to an attorney. Again, this will bring it to the forefront to let them know it's coming, because a lot of times they'll say, of course, I'm going to release my dower. And I think you all know that you might get to the table and they use it as a weapon to not release it. All right, so that takes me through the end of the document. Questions? There was one area, I'll see if I can find it while you tell me if you have any questions.
Anybody else have anything? I feel like I've done a decent amount of talking. Any questions or anything you like or dislike?
Yeah, we take both kinds of opinions.
I have a question. So getting back to the inspections, are we still allowed to put like as deemed necessary? You were saying about waiving like, radon or any of those additional inspections. Are we still allowed to put as deemed necessary by the general home inspection?
That's a good question. And that was in there. Nick, can you scroll up to the inspection section? So if you don't check the line that was all inspections, that opportunity was there.
Okay.
I kind of blew past it and I apologize, but okay. So it is in there.
Okay.
It's right there under 201.
Got it.
There it is under 201. It says it right there.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking. There's another section in here that I don't see right this second, but here it is. Can you go to line 54, Nick? I just want to draw this to your attention too. Again, it's not a trigger date, but it's something I think that you might want to know is in there, beneficial for a buyer. Change in funding. Any change in the source or amount of the buyer's funding must be agreed upon in writing and signed by both parties, unless the change does not impose additional obligations on the seller and does not impact the buyer's compliance with the dates set forth in this contract. If the seller consent is required, such consent shall be not be unreasonably withheld. So the buyer could change their type of financing without having to get permission, as long as it doesn't cost the seller any more money or cost any more time. We haven't had that before.
And then in the chat, we've got some questions about financing. So please confirm again regarding financing. Contract has been accepted with buyer putting 20% down now. As long as the dates stay the same, they only want to put 5% down. Again, what Noreen just said, if it doesn't impact the seller in any way,
yeah,
or the agreement as it exists, then the buyer can change their financing.
Yeah, 54 would line 54 would take care of that. For just that answers your question right there.
And then another question from Kim Coverdale. Lending standard is that a home needs to appraise for so if you're putting 20% down. So if someone's putting 20% down, that gives them some relief from the appraisal amount pressure. Why isn't it written in the contract? Seem to provide that option. Is that correct? So if you state what the down payment is, that's the thing that makes your financing contingency more specific. If you don't state those figures, theoretically, like the lender could say, well, like we can still approve you. We're just going to approve you at 15% down instead of 20. So if you don't put that in there, that's the risk you run. And that was the risk you ran by putting TBD on the financing line of our current contract. But then there is also that appraisal contingency, so that if you don't want to put LTVs in there and you just check that appraisal contingency on 57, then none of the other stuff regarding appraisal shortages and LTVs apply.
Exactly true.
Because you've already made it contingent on the appraisal.
And because the industry has gone in that direction of not always writing down what people are putting down anymore, that's why we felt it was completely appropriate to kind of eliminate it. So I do want to point out two other things.
And Kenil Watson, again,
sure.
A question about changing financing type. Yeah, if it's not going to change anything for the seller, the buyer can change their financing type without any notice to the seller. And honestly, that's always been the case. The contract just didn't say that was the case. It didn't say you couldn't change financing type. It just didn't say you could or couldn't. Now it's saying very explicitly in this contract that you can, and you don't need anything in writing if it's not going to affect the seller in any way.
Good.
So the only thing I would say is there are times where lenders want it to be signed. So if you've checked on this document conventional and the buyer wants to change to FHA, a lot of times the lender wants you to get something signed because you've got a contract that says conventional. So despite what this contract says, you've got another party that may decide something different.
Always those other parties that kind of screw things up. I do want to point
That's,
out that I don't know if your current purchase agreement has this. Ours in my office hasn't for several years, but commission is not on this document. We took it off of ours a few years ago. I don't know if yours still has commission, does it?
we still have the same language that's kind of like the escrow instruction language.
So ours
Yeah.
does, this document does not have a place for commission for a couple of reasons. So one is that it was the attorney's opinion and the group consensus that, commission is identified in the listing agreement and in the MLS. So that's where commission is addressed. And commission is not an agreement between the buyer and the seller. It's between the seller and the listing broker. So we didn't put it on this document because between the MLS, the listing agreement, and your escrow letter, that's where the commission is identified between everyone else. The other reason it was left off was because in our discussion, we discussed perhaps if we didn't address it here, it wouldn't always be in the forefront of everyone, and maybe the consumers would stop trying to negotiate it at the closing at the signing of this document. So there's some merit in that also. Now, some of our brokerages, I don't know if yours is one of them, but some of our brokerages also have an additional commission fee. So that is also not addressed in here. And according to the attorneys, it does not need to be, because typically your additional commission is addressed in your listing agreement, in your consumer guide to agency agreements for your buyers and your sellers. So it also doesn't need to be on this document. We've been seeing Century 21 Homestar, who's using the document, the contract, we have seen where they keep typing it in, and I don't reprimand them because it's their brokerage, but we encourage you not to modify the document in that respect, but because that isn't necessary because it's already addressed everywhere else. So, but that's why that, for any of you that might ask that question, that's why it's not there. And I was teasing John Deegan about that because, one of the things that has always bothered me about Howard Hanna's purchase agreement is they only have their commission addressed on their purchase agreement. They don't have a space even for the co-broke. And I always said that, that always bothered me about their purchase agreement. Well, we'll make sure you get paid, but you don't care about anybody else. So does anyone else have any other questions for me?
There's nothing else in the chat.
Okay.
I don't believe I have anything else.
Nick, you can go to
this has
full
been
screen.
fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. I hope this is helpful for everyone. I do want you to know, if you haven't had enough of me today, I've recently gotten this approved for CEs, for 1.5 hours of CEs, which would just be an elective that I'll be taking on the road and doing some CE classes for this in the future. And I'll eventually move it to a 3-hour CE, so it constitutes core law at the same time, but one thing at a time. So we're that way. My goal of putting this much energy and effort into this is to educate our industry so that we're all learning it together and we can all benefit from it together. Because like I said, regardless if your brokerage chooses to adopt it, you're still going to encounter it in your travels.
For sure. For sure. All right. Well, thank you so much, Noreen. We appreciate it. This has been great.
I appreciate